Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin, and this time we're going to be talking about parapsychological research in the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. Our guest is Dr. Stanley Krippner, Dean of Faculty at the Saybrook Institute, a graduate school in San Francisco. He's the president of the Parapsychological Association. That's an international organization. He's authored several books and over 400 articles in psychological, psychiatric, and parapsychological journals. And in 1971, Dr. Krippner became the first American to be invited to the Soviet Union to lecture on parapsychology. He's also met with scientists in the People's Republic of China who are conducting research with gifted children. Dr. Krippner, how extensive is the parapsychological research in the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China?
Well, in the People's Republic of China, it is not extensive at all. It's only been underway for the past 3 or 4 years. In the Soviet Union, there is a history of parapsychological research which goes back to some of the physiologists who did work before the October Revolution when the communists took power. But at the present time, we really don't know how extensive the research is because most of it is done secretly. The work that we know about is fragmented. It is done largely as part-time work by professional people. Some of it is done by amateurs. A little of the work that is being done at respected universities and laboratories, we do know about it, but we suspect that what is apparent to us is just the tip of the iceberg.
When you went to Russia to lecture, what did you talk about?
Well, I was invited to the Institute of Pedagogical Sciences to talk about the work that I have done in parapsychology in the United States. I had a very fine reception and returned the following year, returned most recently in 1980 when again I was invited to give a talk, this time on dreams and the nature of the unconscious.
Is there something about Soviet society, Soviet culture, that is more conducive to parapsychological activity and study than what we think of as American culture, if there is such a thing? We oftentimes hear that in the Western world, in the Western culture, that the exploration of these sorts of things is inhibited from the earliest ages. Children are not encouraged to remember their dreams, not encouraged to use their extrasensory perception and the other gifts that they may have, and so they disappear in the culture. Is it possible that there's something in the Soviet Union that brings those things out in people more?
Well, I think that that's a very provocative question. What we need to remember is that the United States is actually a very young country, and we have not had the centuries to develop a culture, as is true in Europe and many of the other countries in the world. And the emphasis in the United States has been one of pragmatism, one of practicality, and one of rationality. This has yielded tremendous advances in technology and in science. We do not have in the United States a rich tradition of mysticism and spirituality as they have had in the Soviet Union. Now, once the communist government took power, they attempted to wipe out all vestiges of religion and mysticism, calling all of this superstition and claiming it was really in opposition to the teachings of Marx. However, as the years went by, it was found out that this simply did not happen. Even though the young people did not, by and large, go to church anymore, the elderly people continued to go to church and to really fill the churches up, especially the Russian Orthodox Church, which is the primarily institutionalized religion in the country. But even the people brought up under communism still had vestiges of this mystical tradition, and it came out in other ways. It came out in the arts, it came out in literature, it came out in different types of folk festivals. And now, strangely enough, it's coming out in parapsychology, which is really not mystical at all, which is very scientific, and if anything, tries to be ultra-conservative in terms of how it clings to materialistic explanations of strange phenomena. But I suppose that you might say that it provides a safe and even a scientific and materialistic outlet for these mystical yearnings, which are a very strong part of the Soviet tradition.
Are these things, are they encouraged by the Soviet government, the structure?
They're not encouraged, but they are permitted. In the Soviet press, for example, there's a great deal of freedom of opinion regarding parapsychological phenomena. There is a well-known healer who I met when I was in the Soviet Union by the name of Joan Davichavali, and since I was over there, she has become very celebrated, and there are constant debates in the newspapers and magazines, some claiming that she is quite a remarkable healer, others claiming that it is mere superstition to go to her, that she cannot cure anything.
What does she do? What's her approach to healing?
She comes from the Republic of Georgia, which is one of 18 Soviet republics, similar to our states, and the Soviet republics all have their different constitutions, their different customs, and their different traditions. In Soviet Georgia, for example, the healers can actually get a license to do healing. They can charge money, they can open a clinic, they can see people in their home, and they need to pass a test, and the test will tell that whether or not they are acquainted with human anatomy and symptoms of serious disease, so that these people don't do more harm than they do good. But once they get a license, they can prescribe herbal teas, they can do laying on of hands, they can use different types of guided imagery, they can help people work with their dreams, they can work through movement and massage, and even artistic expression. What Joan does primarily is what is called laying on of hands, and I have seen her work with any number of people. Her point of view is that she is transmitting her energy to the sick person, and that in so doing she is able to correct their biological fields, which have picked up some imbalance, and provide them with enough healing energy so that they can get well. Of course, what she's actually doing is a matter of conjecture, whether it is a power of suggestion, whether it's something like hypnotism, whether it's some other explanation, but as a matter of fact, many people who go to see her get well for one reason or another.
Does she do this in a hypnotic state, or is she totally conscious while she's doing the laying on of the hands?
She is, of course, conscious while she does the laying on of hands, but she does apparently have the ability not necessarily to go into a profound altered state of consciousness herself, but to affect the people that she is working with. I have seen people go into a very profound altered state, hypnotic or not, as a matter of conjecture, when she approaches them and touches them for the first time.
You said that much of the research that's being done there isn't particularly publicized or open. You realize that it's going on, but it's not something that's written up in the newspapers every day. I imagine it's similar to there are areas of research in this country, parapsychological research, which are not highly publicized. Let's talk about the Soviet Union first. Were you able to ascertain the general thrust of the research, what areas they're working in and what they're trying to accomplish?
Well, the research that is going on publicly and that is reported both in the popular press and in the scientific journals, by and large has to do with unusual forms of communication. Now, they are trying to transmit messages at a distance through what we would call telepathy, what they would call biological communication. They are trying to influence sick people, sick plants, sick animals at a distance. And this, of course, is where their studies of healing come into the picture. And they are trying to find practical applications of this ability, whatever it might be. But mainly it centers on distant communication and distant interactions of energy.
With any success that you were able to observe?
Again, it's difficult to claim what success they have had because so much of their research is not completely written up. So much of it appeals to the layperson, that it's basically written up the popular press. But the few instances that I did see of a fairly complete write-up were extremely interesting, and usually involved very small organisms, in some cases cellular tissue. I suppose that the one experiment which they've done most frequently is to try to affect tissue culture at a distance. One way they have done this is to take a chicken embryo and take a small part of it and put it in a test tube, and in another test tube have a different chicken embryo, and then they introduce poisons of one sort or another, radiations, into the first test tube, and usually the cells in the second test tube also start to die, even though there's a distance involved. Now, they find that this can be facilitated if the test tubes or the containers are made out of a crystalline material. And crystal will allow for the passage of ultraviolet radiation. So it's their hypothesis that this effect, which they claim to have achieved hundreds of times, is materialistic. It does not need an occult explanation, and it involves the passage of a ultraviolet code from the sick tissue to the well tissue, which ultimately affects the well tissue and produces the same type of symptoms. Now, this experiment has been attempted to be replicated in the United States with no success. So we took the replication over to the Soviet Union. They read the report, and they said, well, of course it would not meet with success because you did not rotate the materials while they were being tested. Also, the type of instruments that you used were appropriate. So they gave us additional material that would facilitate a proper repetition of their experiment. So far it hasn't been done, but this is one of the benefits of person-to-person contact. You get to ask questions which sometimes are not apparent in the original article.
Is it without, I guess it would be difficult for them, and I'm wondering if you might ascribe some spiritual significance to this. Does their experiment, if in fact it can be duplicated in this country, and we can say yes, that the embryonic tissue has a link through space and time, ultraviolet, does that suggest some sort of a life bond? If it happens with an embryo, then might it be even on a higher level with human beings?
Oh yes, they're already talking about that. In fact, the use of the word spiritual is not prohibited in the Soviet Union, just as long as one does not connect the word spiritual with God or with occult forces, which do not fit into the Marxist doctrine. But the word spirit, the word spiritual are used quite frequently, and there is great interest in this. Now, one of the people I met takes the position that the world is something like a hologram, where there is a small part of a picture in the entire picture. So if you cut a hologram up, you will always get the complete picture when you analyze it. Yes, and they feel that there is a life bond among all living organisms, and that people are linked at very deep levels with each other and with other forms of life. There's a great deal of very interesting speculation on this, and there indeed have been several books by Soviet psychologists and psychiatrists published in the United States recently, which come up with some statements which and some worldviews which you could certainly call spiritual.
It might be a great deterrent to a nuclear holocaust if we are all one.
Well, you, of course, hear a great deal of emphasis on peace in the Soviet Union, a great desire to have a treaty which would reduce nuclear armaments. As you well know, the conditions under which the Soviet government would propose these treaties are quite different than the conditions under which the United States government would accept, and vice versa. And this is quite unfortunate because in the Soviet Union there is a great desire for peace. The people do not want to go through another war like the Second World War, which was so devastating to their country. And of course they cannot understand why the U.S. government is so obstinate and will not agree with what they feel are very simple and advantageous procedures. And many of the scientists I met who are interested in parapsychology do put this drive for peace and this interest in mutual understanding into terms like the holographic universe and the life force and the life bond.
So let's take a look at the flip side of the question that we asked earlier. We've talked quite a bit about what's going on in Russia. Are there some things that are happening that are government-sponsored in parapsychological research in the United States that are not widely publicized?
Well, there probably are, but I'm the last one they would tell about it, so I really don't know. There have been some experiments done by the United States government in the past. There is a journalist who has told me that he now has some 30 cartons of material under the Freedom of Information Act, and eventually will be writing a book on the topic. He also says that most of this work was done back in the 1950s and 1960s, and the work tapered off after the government found out that parapsychological phenomena are simply not dependable. How are you going to use something like telepathy or clairvoyance for military or strategic or espionage purposes if you can't depend on it? And this is basically the same story that I hear from the Soviet emigres, scientists who have left the Soviet Union, scientists who have worked in parapsychological laboratories in the Soviet Union, and they tell about any number of interesting projects being done, but they say so far nothing reliable has come out of this. So I don't really think we have to worry about psychic warfare. I think there is enough to worry about in terms of conventional warfare.
Okay, let's change to another subject. You wrote a book about Kirlian photography. Many of us are familiar with the photographs, at least vaguely, if not personally, and the discussion of auras and that sort of thing. Can you tell us what that's all about? What is Kirlian photography and applications?
Well, Simeon and Valentina Kirlian were a husband and wife team who originated a type of high-voltage photography which did not use a camera. In its simplest form, an object was put on a piece of film, an electric charge was run up to the piece of film, and a corona would appear around the object. Now, if the object was a living object, the corona would have unusual qualities, different colors under different conditions, different types of flares. And this was especially noticeable when people were compared in different states of consciousness, before and during drug ingestion, before and during illness, before and during meditation or hypnosis. Now, Kirlian photography is extremely complicated, and there have been some 24 or 25 variables associated with these coronas, such things as the type of film, the atmosphere in the room, the state of mind of the experimenter. All of these enter into that final picture. So in the United States, there has not really been too much that has proved to be practical. Also, it's really never attracted big research money in the United States. When I was in the Soviet Union, I saw some of their Kirlian photography laboratories, and I was stunned because their equipment is far more sophisticated than anything I have seen in the United States. For example, to keep the atmospheric influences from affecting the corona, they will put rare gases around the object being photographed. Also, to keep heat and moisture from affecting the photograph, they will not allow the finger or the living organism to touch the film, and they will have a non-contact type of Kirlian photography. Well, this is not what's being done in the United States. In my book, Human Possibilities, I devote some time to Kirlian photography in Romania. There, they have found a way to use Kirlian photography for diagnosis of different types of disease. It is a variation of the Soviet type, and it is only being used in a few hospitals, but they claim with some success. And I do have some colleagues in the United States who still think that there is a use for Kirlian photography in the diagnosis of some unusual types of disease, and are working on this, and in a few years we'll see if they come up with anything practical. However, the major misconception that people have in the United States is this corona, which is in the photographs of the Kirlian effect, represent the so-called aura that alleged psychics claim to see. And this simply does not seem to be true, because you can explain this corona through what we know about physics, what we know about electronics, what we know about photography. And the Soviets say that what the psychics call an aura is really a type of biological plasma. In other words, it's a material substance made out of charged ions and free electrons, and that this is one of the first things that disappears when an electric shock is produced into the organism. So even this is not produced on film in Kirlian photography. So I think we should dismiss the notion that Kirlian photography is teaching us anything about the so-called aura and concentrate on what indeed it might tell us, that we cannot get some of the more sophisticated devices which are now available in hospitals. And I just don't know the real answer to that question.
Is it possible that Kirlian photography can teach us something about the nature of life in the experiments that you've seen and the research that you've done on the subject?
Well, I suppose it can, because we do have a very unusual effect that occurs once in a while when one cuts a piece of a leaf off and photographs it. 1 out of every 100 times we get a phantom effect. The disappearing part of the leaf does show up on the film. This has been observed both in the United States and in the Soviet Union, and I do discuss this in my book Human Possibilities, along with the several explanations that have been proposed for it. As a matter of fact, we don't know what it's all about, and I think that this would be the line to investigate if we were to take Kirlian photography seriously and really use what it has to offer to study some of the remaining mysteries of life.
What about the mysteries of death? Are there possibilities there in Kirlian photography?
A number of people have been photographed who are dying or who have just died. Kirlian photography really doesn't seem to show any type of emanation leaving the body. What it does show, of course, is that over time the corona will decrease. This is most usefully done with organisms such as leaves, which are photographed every few hours as they die. Now, even after the leaf is dead, even after the organism is dead, you still get a small corona. But you see, you get that corona with pennies, with stones, with things which do not have life. You get that merely as a result of the what is called the cold electron emission, which happens when you apply electricity to film upon which an object is resting.
What about the studies in the Soviet Union, if outside of Kirlian photography, that are being done with death and near-death experiences and some of the other things that have fascinated us, I guess, from the beginning?
Well, it's very interesting that the book Life After Life by Moody has not been officially translated or published in the Soviet Union, but there have been unofficial translations that are being passed around the country simply as a result of people typing them and making carbon copies. This is something which the government usually permits. It doesn't do anything deleterious to state security unless it's a political tract that is passed around this way. But Dr. Moody's book has triggered quite a response among Soviet physicians who are now telling us, yes, we have had some of our patients report similar experiences. And so there is sort of a underground interest in this topic. Again, trying to explain it materialistically and trying not to use explanations that would contain elements that would get them into trouble philosophically. So I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens as years go by. Also in Romania, one of the leading biologists whose work is strictly according to Marxist materialism is working on a theory of life after death, which he claims is not in violation of Marx. And a Soviet philosopher by the name of Spirkin is devoting some of his time to extending Marx to cover all of these unusual parapsychological phenomena. And again, he is saying Marx is very flexible. Marxism can accommodate these new findings. And again, time will tell how receptive people are to this approach. But yes, there is quite an interest in these topics in the Soviet Union, and very little of it appears in the popular press, or and none, of course, in the scientific literature. But it'll be interesting to see what happens as time goes on. You see, in the Soviet Union right now, there is an interesting cultural phenomenon of people interested in what we were interested in back in the 60s. Everything from rock and roll music to health foods to different lifestyles. And this has not really hit the American press, and it certainly has not hit the government, because we do not know how to take advantage of this phenomena. We do not know how to get in contact with Soviet citizens and provide these linkages. I think one of the very unfortunate things that President Carter did was to cancel U.S. participation in the Olympics. This would have brought tens of thousands of American citizens to the Soviet Union and would have formed information contact and bonds which would have been impossible to do under any other situation. The Esalen Institute is trying in a very small way to do this at the present time. They have a Soviet-American exchange program, and a number of American scientists have gone to the Soviet Union. Soviet scientists have come out here, especially to San Francisco, where we've hosted them and had discussions with them. And we find that we have much more in common than we do in differences.
We have a couple of minutes remaining, and there are several subjects I just want to touch on briefly. The first is psychic abilities. Are they environmental? Are they learned? Are they natural? Are they something that people are born with?
Of course, nobody knows. You're well aware that there are many prominent scientists who think there are no such things as psychic abilities. And those of us that think that there are, albeit we disagree on the nature of these abilities, really don't know the answer to that question. I specifically think it's a human potential which is more favored in some cultures than in others.
Are gifted children more likely to be psychic than average children?
Again, we really don't know for sure. There have been some studies trying to correlate psychic ability with creativity. Either there is no correlation or there is a positive correlation. Same thing when psychic ability is correlated with intelligence. Either there's no correlation or a positive correlation. In no case is there a negative correlation, so that indicates that there might indeed be some sort of a tenuous link.
Here in San Francisco, an always popular topic is the discussion of earthquakes, earthquake preparedness, earthquake predictability. Is there some research being done in that area here in this country, also in the Soviet Union, for psychic ability to predict earthquakes?
Well, we haven't said much about China, and this, of course, is a concern in China. What they've done there is something very clever, is to monitor the strange behavior of birds and animals. I really think that's our best bet for an early warning system for earthquakes, because they're able to pick up clues that human beings can't really pick up, even with our instruments.
Is that done just by feeling the vibrations as the earthquake has already happened, or are they able to predict hours, days in advance?
No, the animals and birds move out sometime in advance. And again, we're not sure why, but when there is this migration of animals and birds, that's often a sign that the earthquake is coming, at least according to the Chinese scientists I spoke to.
What kind of research are you doing at Saybrook Institute right now here in the city?
I'm advising students who are working on their PhDs in psychology. One of my students is going to the Soviet Union to study Soviet healers, and she has permission from the Soviets to do this. Another one of my students has been studying healers in England and the United States, finding that when they do a laying on of hands of water, there are some subtle changes in the water that can be detected through ultraviolet radiation that non-healers cannot affect. And I have another student who is doing her doctoral research on gifted children and psychic abilities. So these are a few of the topics that some of my students are engaged in. And then, of course, I have many other students who are working in much more conventional areas, such as psychotherapy, marriage, and different types of cross-cultural studies.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.